Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Cathy Linh Che. I will tell you all about Cathy in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment we exert toward others. But when you do it from a leadership perspective, and Cathy has a very unique perspective on leadership and culture, and you learn to bring people together for common cause. So, Linh Che, welcome to Grace Under Pressure.
Thank you so much for having me, John. I appreciate your welcoming me to your space.
Absolutely. Cathy Linh Che is a Vietnamese American writer. She's a multidisciplinary writer. And by the way, her film, she's a filmmaker, just won a jury award at Sundance Film Festival, which is huge. Cathy is also a poet. And that's what we're going to talk about today when her brand new book, Becoming Ghosts. So I'll tell you all about it. So I was intrigued by your book. I've read your poems, and you have a compelling story to tell. So you've told the story of We Were Scenery about the making of Apocalypse Now, where your parents were extras. So what led you to this topic? Because it's compelling, and then into the book Becoming Ghost. So.
Thank you so much for that question. So essentially, I grew up listening to my parents' stories around the kitchen table. So they would tell me about their lives in Vietnam and their lives in the Philippines, which were, so my parents lived under wartime, essentially their whole lives from birth until, I'm so sorry.
That we're live. Those things happen. It's great.
But from birth until wartime, like through their lives. So my mom until she was 22 years old, my dad until he was 35, lived a full life in Vietnam under a war, and they escaped on a boat and ended up in the Philippines. And from there, they were cast as extras in Apocalypse Now, along with all of the other refugees who ended up in the refugee camp in the Philippines. And that was, it was just a story I grew up with. I always knew about it. My parents at the kitchen table would tell me all about their lives because that was our connection to Vietnam, because they didn't have a strong interest in going back to Vietnam as refugees. They felt unsafe there. You know, their lives were not pleasant. You know, my dad, you know, like both of their educations were interrupted. So, I wanted, you know, as a writer, I would, you know, as a burgeoning poet or young person, I wanted to go to the library, see, you know, to study up on my own history. And I didn't see their voices really represented there. And that really took me to poetry.
Right. You know, something you said is fascinating, because you said your parents were, I'm going to say, consciously committed to sharing their experience of Vietnam with you. Because very often immigrants don't do that. They want to acclimate. I'm grandson of Italian immigrants, and while they were proud of their heritage, everything was better. My grandfather, I can still hear him. Everything is better here. So, so now it's led you to this Becoming Ghost, which is a compendium of stories, and you tell it in different ways. So. And it's shaped around, I think, if I get it right, the making of Apocalypse Now. So what drew you to that analogy? So
I think it's very interesting to have, first of all, just a story that's ostensibly about the Vietnam War, where my parents are the center of that story. At least in our lives, that's how we felt. But for them to essentially be in this very famous Vietnam War Oscar-winning epic, that put them in the margins. They didn't have any FaceTime. They didn't have any lines. And so to move that from the margins or the extra area into the center was very important to me, because that's how I feel oftentimes when I was studying. You know, I took Vietnam War, history courses in college, and my parents were barely mentioned, or people like my family. But to me, to my family, we are at the center of our story. And like I said, my parents are very, very prolific storytellers because they lived these lives together, and they
Mhm.
had kids who, all of us were born in the US. So
Mhm.
we don't have any connection to Vietnam outside of the stories. Unless we visit, which I've only gone 5 times in my life, so
Yeah.
there's something connective about that.
Well, there is a metaphor. The title of the film is "We Were Scenery," and it's actually poignant because it's a story about Vietnam where the people who live there are don't have any speaking role, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and I and I know that in the movie this or in the film The Spy Catcher, which is based on a novel, and it was, got to get that right. It's the sympathizer, excuse me,
Mhm.
and so the extras, and there's a scene of where there are extras there, and they're Chinese, but to an American audience, quote, "You all look alike," which is a marginalization of people, and there.
Mhm.
So that led you to want to tell your story more evocatively. Am I correct in that? So.
Yeah, that's true. And I think poetry offers something, the reason why I have a film and I have a poetry book, and I'm also working in nonfiction and performance. We did a 3 channel video installation. The reason why we did that is because each genre offers something different that I can utilize in its form and function. So a lot of the poems in this book, they're using this golden shovel form where and I'm using lines from the screenplay of Apocalypse Now and kind of shifting them to the edge. And so
Mhm.
down the page, you'll read something like napalm, sun, nothing else in the world smells like that. I love the smell of napalm in the morning, a
Mhm.
very famous line. And to take that and to move that aside and fill it in with my father's story, my mother's story, my grandmother's story, just Vietnamese voices in the center.
Mhm.
But I'm also in the poetry book, I'm adopting their voices. And that's part of the becoming ghost idea is that there's a kind of interesting aspect of poetry that I love is that it's a little poetic. It's seance like to me, at least. There is a kind of connection that I feel to something very intuitive or something that is a little, it's almost like you're tuning a radio into a frequency and you're doing some transcription work. I mean, not everybody works that way, but I do. And
Mhm.
to be able to channel voices through my English, my mother, my father, my grandmother, other Vietnamese people, other extras, that is part of my process and my method. So that's a major part of the story.
Oh, thank you. And I love how you have an economy of words. Why don't we read? Why don't we, instead of talking about it, pick out a poem that you'd like to read? And I think is it Go that you'd like to read? So,
I can read Go. I'll just preface this. It doesn't talk that much about Apocalypse Now. What this poem actually talks about is my relationship with my father, who the other aspect of the title is it's related to what happens when I'm writing the story out of love and care from my family, and I get disowned because that is just part of my family dynamic. It's one can explain it away in multiple ways, but there is a family dynamic that is difficult. So how do I deal with the fact of the the pain and heartache of feeling no longer part of my family, but that's who made me and that's who helped me narrate who I am, and that's who I'm writing about. So
right.
this is about me and my dad. So uh,
Good.
here we go. Go. Because the birds sculpted the air with their song, I sent that flash across the sea. Candle in a paper lantern. The flame rose and dipped. I've been hiding from my father. Fog, damp, pall over the city. I inked the sprues onto paper. Years ago in Highland Park, we picnicked in the backyard. We slept in the living room. I clung to my beautiful mother. flipped the pillow and pressed against its coolness. I held grudges like tiny fists full of sand, then let go. I kissed the sky and the air and the ocean's cobalt hue. Murky alphabet. I faltered the letter. I allied the gaps. If the opalescent dew meant anything, it meant that one day I'd be lifted above my feelings. You'd be less than a feeling. The way every lover I've known no longer hurts me. Those old charges detonated. Here and now, I make room for joy. Birds ribbon the air with their singing. Their voices riot up. The planes with their hulking engines, they fly too. Your lips, I uninterrupt. I Charlie horse and miracle ride your absence. Puddle of salt water, shivering wound. Seaweed, we sing of losses. Cold under this blanket, I am waiting for an alarm to sing. I've polished this anger, and now it's a knife. I'm hardened as a hunter ornamenting his cave with the bones of the dead. I'm so sick of history dragging behind me. I don't want to be sad, but my father has retreated, and the lashes across his back have not healed, and he could have killed himself, and we'd be blamed. Call the police. We stood barefoot on the street, listening to my father smash against the garage walls. I fling stones into the ether. I wash my hands in ink. The lost in the fog body, born of matter, historyless, untethered. Better to be alive and bewildered. At least I can name the thing. To love my father is to love his wounds. In times like these, we present our hurts like old toys we polish up to show each other who we used to be.
Very evocative. And there's a metaphor in there that I wash my hands in ink. It's kind of this is your expression. I mean, you're a poet, so you're putting the words down on paper. However, it comes out as paper because we have the book, Becoming Ghost.
Yes.
That, and I'm sensing in here too the sense of disruption, certainly in your parents' life, or certainly in your father. And through the scope of all of the poems, there's a sense, to me, a sense of rootlessness. They left Vietnam hardly, I mean, because of dire circumstances, went to the Philippines, then to Southern California and a couple of places there. So they're sort of never settled. Am I correct in that? And does that contribute to this sense of rootlessness? Yeah.
Yeah, there is a sense of rootlessness, and there is a sense of wanting writing to be a place of homemaking, or at least transcribing something so that it exists in a way that, like I mentioned, it wasn't in the library. Our narratives weren't sort of written around us, even if they were written in words, through our communication with each other. And then to lose that communication with one another felt really difficult. And what do you do with that? So I think part of this book is also about what happens when we no longer physically can communicate. So how do I communicate with everybody else? And so part of it was my imagination. I was thinking, okay, my dad's not talking to me, so who does he become? Who do I become to him in these moments? So we sort of dematerialize into these ghostly figures in each other's lives. I think,
and then, but there's also a theme throughout the book about forgiveness. So, how did you come to grips with that, or why did you want to focus on forgiveness, which is part of our human condition?
So. Yeah, I think it's a complex question for me, because I think that it's what, I was raised in a very Catholic tradition. So, you go to confession, and that's part of, writing a book is a confessional for me. I come from the confessional school of poetry, like putting out their confession. And then there's a absolvement, and so there is a sense for me, writing it down is a kind of coming to terms with like, this is what I've done, I've sinned in this way, or I've said these things, or we've done these things, and there being a kind of desire for forgiveness comes very naturally in my
Right.
background. And when there's a rupture, we want to figure out, like, how do we repair that rupture? And for me, it's not actually through having a conversation with my dad. Unfortunately, that's not how it's working. It's actually quite internal. It's about forgiving myself and forgiving him, and just coming to a place of letting go. So I have like that line in Go where I say, as a child, I would hold these fists full of sand and just grudges, like tiny fists of sand, just let it go. And so as an adult, just learning how to work through a difficulty or a pain, or something that I'd love, to let go, and just learning how to emotionally let go. And some of that is, for me at least, some of that is to write it down, to, like, I think pretending that it doesn't exist doesn't actually help me. Like, to actually go deeply into it
Right.
and contend with what happens between people allows me to sort of look around and have more grace and let it go.
That's no, it rings true. Now it's interesting because you had mentioned earlier, moments ago, about the immigrant experience in popular culture, and
Mhm.
there's the broad scope of traditional American culture, which would have been,
Mhm.
Apocalypse Now was
Totally.
unique for its time because it was the first major film to deal with the Vietnam experience, which was very raw still in those times.
Mhm.
But we didn't think about you, the
Oh, yeah.
Vietnamese people. But now things are changing. It's 50 years the U.S. has been removed from Vietnam, coming up this April, and which is interesting to me is you've woven in popular culture into your book, Becoming Ghost,
Mhm.
because it's not just Apocalypse Now; it's The Walking Dead, which is
Yeah.
television. So, how did you come on to The Walking Dead? Yeah.
I mean, that happened over time, but I was watching television, and it was about erasure to some degree, because at the time I was watching in 2015, and there weren't that many Asian American main characters, and one
Mhm.
of the people as part of the ensemble cast is Stephen Yun, and he embodied a very complex character who people really connected to, and I did too. So I felt, while watching that, this strange resonance between not only a sense of, okay, this is the opposite of erasure. Here's somebody who's complex, who gets to play a main character, who has a lot of lines. And then on the other hand, he actually, spoiler, he gets killed off, so there's
Of
that.
course, because it's the minority.
I mean, he lasts for quite a while, but he gets killed off.
Yeah.
And so there's that. And then another aspect of just The Walking Dead is that it's about um, it's about these people escaping the zombie apocalypse and being moved around. So people that they thought were people they recognized, because the Vietnam War was there were many powers at play, but it was also the North versus the South. So you're fighting people who look like you, like you're literally fighting some of
It
your
was a civil war.
times.
Yeah,
It was a
so
civil war, right? Not to say there's not other factors, but
yeah.
definitely a civil war. And so people who you thought were, okay, this is my family, they're actually fighting against each other. And war makes people something else entirely. So I think that there was this resonance between my family, who were refugees, who were escaping a war and escaping violence, and The Walking Dead, you're escaping the people who are, like, you think that this is somebody who I love, but they're attacking me suddenly. So that violence really had a resonance to me as well, in that regard.
You use the term erasure, and you know, our in our American history, we have our myths, of our founding fathers and how it grew the nation and all of this, and it's essentially the story. And even with immigrants, it's the story of white people, and even our Black brothers and sisters were here far longer than most Americans. But there's kind of
Mhm.
a erasure until recently, and it's also the immigrant experience. Hey, we've erased Native American history and all that. So, with your poetry, are you taking back your identity, or how does that play with you, Cathy? So,
Well, it's interesting because Vietnamese people in this country, for the most part, are 50 years deep, right? The end of the war is 1975. So, April 30th is the end of the Vietnam War officially. And so there is a whole group of my generation or the next generation. There's previous generation people, but fewer because people had to survive and they may not have been writing in English.
sure.
Um, so we are taking up filling in and narrating our stories and conversing with one another to tell our stories. And a lot of what you said about American history, why we know something about the civil rights movement and why we know anything about Native American history was this was fought for. This was fought for in the late 60s, during the same time that the Vietnam War happened. And in fact, the Vietnam War was a catalyst very much for the Asian American movement. So Asian Americans didn't, they were called Oriental before 1968 because a group of Asian American people banded together, young college students banded together and said, we want to see ourselves represented in our texts. We want to name ourselves. So like that, I am participating and I am very much an inheritor of, the people who fought so hard to make sure that they could see themselves in their texts, see themselves taught in college campuses, see themselves in all of these ways. And like I said, the Vietnam War was this moment when a lot of Asians in the United States saw themselves, people looking like themselves, my family, being bombed and, murdered and sniped and all of these things. And so feeling like they needed to have a place to fight against the war on
Mhm.
American soil, to fight against the war. So, but also to fight for their own um, lives in some ways, fight for their own self-definition, fight for their own ability to narrativize their own lives, to have a community of people who
Yeah,
are word. So even during that movement, there were all of these amazing magazines that were being published, and they always had a poetry folio. It was like part of, like, the cultural front is part of the political front. So that is
sure.
something I deeply connect with and feel like I've inherited.
Well, you have. Germaine to your story, if I take a step back, becoming Ghost, it's, if I can use the word, part memoir too. Am I correct? So you were born in the United States 4 years after your parents had emigrated here. And so, but as you tell their stories, you're going back to Vietnam, their experience in the Philippines, where they were even more, their first journey of being immigrants, and then to the U.S. And that, as you wrote in Go, how they ended up. Excuse me, the sense of place and things like that. So
Mhm.
you're claiming your history and casting it
Yeah.
in poetic form. Is that correct? So
Yeah, that's very correct. And I think that I'm very interested in the imagining what would it be like. Well, I mean, I wrote the poems before I made a film, but I
mhm.
was always imagining what would it would be like if my parents were the stars of their own film. If we were to make our own film, what would that look like? So it's in the book. It's very speculative. It's like, what if we were able to do that? And then in real life, I did actually like collaborate with somebody to make a film, and also troubling that. What does it mean for me, this American, so-called American, but disowned daughter
Well,
to
I say you're
be.
American.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm mad at America, so I don't know how I feel, but my
Well, I think from time to time and through whatever your political views, you always get mad at America, and that's our joy. And
yes,
hopefully, we'll come out positively on the other end. So,
yeah.
anyway,
So
yes.
yeah, just to trouble the fact that if I am the one writing this narrative and directing it, but it's really my parents' story. That's also something I think about. There is a power dynamic in that to some degree as well. Being a daughter, there's a power dynamic. Wielding English, there's a power dynamic.
Right. Now, I have to ask you because this just popped into mind, and I'm totally ignorant, so I shouldn't ask this question, but I will. I, I love how your publisher called this book your sophomore collection of poetry, as if you're in high school. I mean, so what was your first book of poetry about?
Yeah, my first book of poetry is called Split, and it is about my parents' lives as Vietnam War refugees, but I also write a lot about like various forms of sexual assault and sexual violence. And that was something that I felt very much, this was before Me Too, that there was so much silence around that. And just learning how to define my own experience in that. So just the intersection of the personal and political with war and sexual violence, and similarly, just sort of wanting to create a space where I could come out on the other side and feel empowered by the ability to do that writing.
Right. Well, that's quite evocative and powerful. Now, you also teach writing and or teach poetry, and you told me you deal with poets of all generations, even old people like me. So, what do you find when new poets come to you? Not necessarily young poets, but new poets. What do they grasp, or what do they wrestle with first? Is there a universal, or what do you see? So,
I don't think there's anything universal, but the love of poetry, I think in some ways is rooted with this love of expression, and especially because our everyday experience, our everyday speech, you can't always talk about things that are uncomfortable. People feel unable to find the language for it, and poetry is this kind of sacred space where you find the language to talk about the things that are essentially human, to play with language, to do anything with it, but it's a different kind of space where you can express differently. And I think that's what people really connect to. They want to be able to say things that maybe in polite conversation you're not fully able to express, because that's not how people feel comfortable.
right. Well, in your poetry, you go to the soul, to the bone, if you would say, but to the soul, and reveal yourself and your experience and that of your family. So you write with candor and with courage. So on
Yeah.
that, as you know, I've asked every guest to tell a story about grace. Is there something you'd like to share with us, Cathy Linh Che? So
Sure. Just one thing I'll just say about the last comment is that I think Sylvia Plath calls it the blood jet. It is that candor, that sort of you get to the root or the source. And I think that grace, there's so many things. I've been thinking so much about grace. I think we live in a culture that's very product. You got to be, like, it's very perfectionistic. It's oriented toward productivity, and like even people feel guilty for taking time off to rest and heal. So I was recently sick, and understanding how to give myself and other people grace when they they need not to be perfect or productive. So I think in addition, just thinking about the book Becoming Ghost, I'm still working through forgiveness and just learning how to give myself grace to like have a boundary with my father, but also just like in that space really love him, love other people within the bounds of like understanding what are the things that I need. And so honoring that, and that's a type of grace. And in honoring that allows me to give other people immense grace and love.
you just hit the nail on the head. You hit the duality of grace. It's
Mhm.
given to us, no strings attached. We show it to others, but we need it ourselves. And so you
Yeah.
did the whole thing right there. So,
Thank you so much, Ron.
Cathy Linh Che, your book is Becoming Ghost. Where can we find you?
So my website is cathylinche.com, and I'm on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. You can just find me, Cathy Linh Che, at those channels. I guess I'm also on Blue Sky. So Thank you so much for making time to chat with me.
Great. And your book will be published in April, and it will be available everywhere, correct?
April 29th, 2025, available everywhere, out with Washington Square Press. You know, go ahead and find it online at your favorite independent bookstore. If they're not there in the library, go ahead and order it, ask your independent bookstore to order it as well.
Right. Cathy Linh Che, it's been an honor to speak to you. And with that, we will go out.
Thank you.